All right, we'll say good morning. I apologize for the last minute change in schedule, but upon looking at upon looking at the daf again, we need the extra 5 minutes. So let's begin. So let's pick up today's daf is Sadik 95. We are picking up on Sadik Dalit Amud Beis 94b, and we're going to pick up at Tashma. So we'll say, so remember again, the Gemara is in the midst of trying to go ahead and prove or disprove the position of Rav Huna. Remember, the last Mishnah introduced to us the idea that when you purchase any type of produce, by definition you accept a certain level or a certain volume, a certain percentage, we'll call it, of impurities. All right. Everybody get moved in? Good. All right, so we accept a certain level of impurities, and at that level, again, the purchaser does not have the right to claim that he's been defrauded by the seller. Rav Huna said, however, once a buyer discovers that the percentage of impurities is above the normally accepted threshold, so then again, the halacha is that once you're separating out impurities, you have the right to remove all of the impurities. So it says the Gemara Tashma, the Tani Rabin Barav Nachman, Lo as Hamosra Bilbadu Machzer, Ela Machzer Lo as Kal Harava and Kulas. Well, this is actually a very interesting case that Rashbam points out over here. Tashma, the Tani Rabin, look at that Rashbam, almost right across. The Kaman Beperek, base car, Tnan, base car Afar Nimocher Lecha, Mada Bechevel, Vim Amarlo Hin Chaser Hin Yesra Pilu Piches Rovelasas. We'll say a base car is made up of 30 sa'ah of land. The halacha is that the assumption is that up to an additional quarter core will not go ahead and invalidate the sale. In other words, we assume that land measurements, remember we spoke about this actually, that if you were dividing up an estate, the halacha is you have to make sure to measure out the land either together in the rainy season or in the summer. And the reason for that is because why? Is because at the end of the day, they measured with a rope, and the rope would expand or contract depending on the weather. If you measure in different seasons, then lemaisa, again, you may end up with different land measurements. So the assumption is there's normally a quarter of a kav extra per sa'ah of land. So what happens if at the end of the day there was more than a quarter of a kav? So then the Rabbi Bar Nachman says, Lo as Hamosra Bilbadu Machzer, you don't only return the additional amount, the additional quarter of a kav, Ela Machzer Lo as Kal Hariva and Kulam, but rather you return all of the additional quarter kav amounts as well. What do you see from here? Amma Heicha Deboy Adura Kula Mahadar. Both you see from your support to Rav Huna that when Lamaisa there's an obligation to return an excess amount, it essentially requires you to return the full excess, the entire amount, up until the stipulated amount of the transaction, like Rav Huna. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not a raya. Hacha hashta, over here, bosay of tzadikei, haki hashta hasam, hein chaser, hein yasir amalei. Bosay, in this case over here, the seller said, I'm selling you a core of land, more or less. Right? Literally again, chaser, yasir. A little bit more, a little bit less. Miu, Revia lo chashiv. So therefore, we'll say if the error is just by simply a quarter of a kav of land, that's not chashiv enough to warrant any type of redoing of the transaction. Yes, sir, may revia, but more than a quarter of a kav, chashiv. Then ultimately, again, I will say that is considered to be more significant. Because we will say since a number of these quarter kavs could combine together and to form a field the size of 9 kavin. Therefore, what? It's considered to be a davar chashuv, and therefore, ultimately, again, it does return ultimately to the owner. Fine. So we'll say, so therefore, again, the Gemara is suggesting we thought this price would be approved to Rav Huna. It turns out that it wasn't approved to Rav Huna. And therefore, we're back where we started. And we'll say again, trying to clear one simple yisod. Rav Huna's principle is that everyone agrees that there's a certain amount of, we'll call it, we assumed for now that there's a certain amount of margin of error that is included in every single sale. Sales, transactions are not always exact. So therefore, there's a certain margin of error. Rav Huna's chap is that once you exceed that margin of error, then by definition, you're obligated to remove out all of the error and just simply go ahead and establish the transaction based on its purest form, the way it's supposed to be. So we're trying to figure out again whether Allah is like Rav Huna, not Rav Huna. Tashma. Ha'ona pachos mishasos niknameka. So we'll say the halacha is Oh no. So now remember again is overcharging. See, if you overcharge someone, but you overcharge less than a sixth, then nikna mekach. Then I both say ultimately again, we assume it's negligible, the transaction stands. Yoser mishasus. However, again, if the overcharging was more than a sixth, then batal mekach. Then I will say the halacha is the transaction is void. Shasus, but if the transaction was 1/6, meaning, if the overcharge was exactly 1/6, then what's the halacha? Kana umachzir ona. Then I will say in that case again, the halacha is the transaction stands, but the ona must be returned. So asks the Gemara, Amai. I don't understand. As well say, the Gemara is asking, the Rashbam points out, take a look at the Rashbam. He says, Va'amai, machzir kol ha'ona, bein shasus, bein yeser mishsus. So we'll say, so remember again, in two cases, whether you overcharge by 1/6 exactly or by more than a sixth, what's the halacha? You have to return the entire amount of the overcharge. So ask the Gemara, I don't understand. Why is that? Lehadir ad pachos mishasus. We'll say, I have a great chap. Whenever you have ona'ah, the simplest remedy is to what? Return the amount of the overcharge up until a sixth. Up until the sixth. Reduce it to the threshold below the sixth. Everyone agrees that what? Any amount of overcharge below a sixth, ultimately again, is batal. So we'll say, so why not just go ahead and look at it that way? In other words, the fact that you're saying you have to return the full overcharge amount seems to be a proof to who? To Rav Huna. Because Rav Huna's whole chap is that once you exceed what we'll call the exceptional excess threshold. The exceptional excess threshold, once you exceed that, you have to remove all the quote-unquote impurities. Whether those are impurities mixed within produce or whether that's ona'ah, you have to remove all of it. So as you see proof to the Shmamina, kol hechi d'boy ladure, both side appears in here that any time there is an obligation upon, we'll call it the seller, to go ahead and, or the purchaser, the purchaser to go ahead and return some level of excess, you have to remove all of the excess. To which the Gemara says, no. Hachi hashta hasab meikara shava b'shava amarli. So we'll say, no, it's not like that. You see, under normal circumstances, when you go ahead and you sell something to someone, and a person is purchasing something from your boss, so the assumption is you're purchasing is shava b'shava. In other words, we'll say if I purchase something from someone, it's not the pshat that I'm saying to them, listen, I believe the price that you're charging me is the correct price, give or take a less than a sixth. I assume that I'm paying for what I'm getting. That's called shava b'shava. Miu pachos mishusus lo yudiyeh b'mana. But we'll say the general assumption is that if I'm being overcharged by a sixth, okay, a sixth within a mana, people don't normally know. That's generally a negligible amount. Umachil inish. And therefore a person is mochel. Shasus. But we'll say if the overcharging is a sixth, Yediyah people do know that, v'lo machel inish. And a person is not mochel. Yaser mishasus. More than a sixth, mekach ta'usu. Ubatal mekach. And I will say more than a sixth is such an egregious level of overcharging that by definition, again, it is considered to be a bittul mekach. Ultimately, again, the entire sale is negated. So we'll say, so the Gemara is suggesting over here is that lemaisa is actually interesting yisod in ona'ah in general. Generally, when people transact, if I buy something, I am assuming that I am paying for what I'm getting, and I am assuming that there's no level of overcharging. If there happens to be overcharging of more than a sixth, the Gemara just suggests most people can't pick up on that because that's in a gray area. But also understand they're also dealing with money, with currency that has an actual value. So therefore, again, it could be that on any given day, there is always a certain small measure of currency fluctuation that may not be even detectable by the buyer and the seller. But the yesod ultimately is, therefore we assume within a sixth it's not detectable. More than a sixth, I will say, ultimately, again, no one's mochel. So again, no proof to Rav Huna. Tashma, ha-makabel sada mechaber alita, hareizu mekabel alav eser burios lenes. Well, this is another interesting case. I go ahead, look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Ha-makabel, we'll say, Suran Sadik came with Aleph, pretty much like right in the middle of the page. Tashma. So look at Rashbam HaMakabel. Poel sheMakabel alav bischar lita kol sadeh chaveru kashir shiacholun lita kigomimata asar lebesav. Listen to this. So Reuven hires me to go ahead and plant his field. Okay, so what happens? So I get a certain wage for planting the field, whatever it is. So now Reuven, the landowner, accepts upon himself that there's going to be a certain percentage of my planting that does not sprout. So therefore, again, the Gemara says that if I go ahead and I receive a field from Reuven to plant, in other words, he hired me as a contractor, he agrees to accept upon himself that there'll be 10 trees per 100 that do not sprout fruit. So 10 trees per 100 that do not sprout anything. Mikan, Yoser Mikan, but I will say if it turns out that what? If it turns out that it's more than 10 trees per 100, Yoser Mikan, Megalgilin Alav Esakol. So I will say if it turns out that it's more than 10 per 100, then what? Then Lamaisa, I'm obligated to compensate him, to pay him back for the entire number of trees that did not sprout. So we'll say, again, seems to be, so what we're saying over here is if I'm hired as a tree contractor, there's an acceptable percentage of trees that are not going to sprout. We'll call it 10 per 100, 1/10. But Lamaisa, if let's say it turns out that 11 trees don't sprout, then I'm obligated to go ahead and compensate. Now we'll say, when we say compensate, essentially what it would mean is I'd be obligated to replant all 11 trees. All 11 trees. So once I exceed the acceptable threshold of non-sprouting or of non-successful trees, I'm obligated to go ahead and compensate Reuven for all of them. Which I will say again would seem to be approved to who? Seem to be approved to Rav Huna. I'm going to put it in Yeshua. No. Kol yaser mikan kebalita mitchila dami. See, it's different. I will say, once you get over the threshold of 10 trees is like a brand new field onto itself. So again, it's not a raya to Rav Huna. It's just that once you already have such a significant number of trees that have not sprouted, that area of 10 or more trees is like a field unto itself, and therefore it's as if I've been given a new contract, as if I've been given a new job to go and replant that field. So both say, so bottom line, the Gemara does not conclusively prove one way or the other if we paskin like Rav Huna. So who do we paskin like? So I'll tell you something amazing. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, this is in Choshen Mishpat, Reish Mishpat Sif Aleph. Listen to this. So the Shulchan Aruch discusses this. Hamocher chitum lechavero mekabel avro v'kitnios chosas. So the Shulchan Aruch writes this, that if I sell produce to my friend, there's an acceptable level of what's the right word? Impurity. There's a certain acceptable level of mixed in impurities into whatever produce I'm selling. And the Shulchan Aruch goes through this. For kitnios, for legumes, it's one thing. For sa'orim, it's another thing. For lentils, it's another thing. For te'inim, so on and so forth. So again, nimtza bahem, but here's the operative part for us. Let's say, nimtza bahem yeser al shi'urim ha'elu. We both say, what happens if it turns out that there is a higher than accepted level of impurities in any of these items that I've purchased? So what's the halacha? Even any small amount, yinafa hakol v'yitin lo aperos minufim uburim she'im b'im klum. Both sides, Shulchan Aruch passes like Rav Huna, that once as a seller you exceed what we call, the normative impurity amount, then the halacha is the seller bears the responsibility for sifting out all of the impurities and giving the purchaser a whole measure. So we'll say, so we paskin like Rav Huna, and it appears based on the word. So we'll say, remember again 2 days ago when you learned Rav Huna. We learned Rav Huna. Remember again the Gemara Shaila. What was the Shaila of Rav Huna? What was the Shaila? Is it a din or a knas? Right? Is this a halakha or is this a penalty? It sounds like from the Shulchan Aruch that it's a penalty. That's what it sounds like. So the halacha is, if you are, so what this does is, this ensures that a seller remains honest. Because you could very easily go out, I will say again, think about this for just a moment. Especially if you are in an industry of high volume, right? High volume industry. So you make your profit on volume, not necessarily on each individual transaction. Mixing in a bit more impurities into each of your customers' orders could result in some significant profit. So in order to go ahead and dissuade the seller from doing that, essentially the halacha penalizes the seller. That if it turns out that you have a too high of an impurity ratio into your produce, you, the seller, become obligated to remove all of the impurities and give your purchaser a full measure. So we'll say that indeed is the halacha. Good. Martev Shayan. So we'll say, remember again, next case in the Mishnah was, A wine cellar. So if you sell someone a wine cellar, so I'll say, so what is the halacha? The halacha is that the purchaser accepts upon himself 10 sour barrels per 100. So the assumption is that there's a 1/10 souring rate. Says the Gemara, Hechidami, what's the case? So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. So we'll say, the Gemara is not going to ask, what's the verbiage of this transaction? So watch this. So says the Gemara, let's say I'm the seller, I'm selling to Ruvain. If I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you a wine cellar, this is what we call Martiv Shal Yayin Stam, I'm selling you a wine cellar, Kasha, there's a problem. Now we'll discuss what the problem is. If I say to Ruvain, the purchaser, I'm selling you this wine cellar, there's a kasha. So what's the kasha? We'll say, kasha. So if I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you this wine cellar, what's the problem? We'll say, this is fascinating. This sanya. So if I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you this wine cellar, then what's the halacha? Martif shal yayin ani mocher lecha. Now we'll say, now the wording over here is going to be very specific. This case is no zeh. Martif yayin ani mocher lecha. I'm selling you a wine cellar. So we'll say, what does it mean if I'm selling you a wine cellar? So what's the halacha? No sein lo yayin shakulo yafa. Both say the halacha is I have an obligation to provide Ruvain with good wine. Now both say yayin shakulo yafa. Now what does that mean? Good wine. If you look at the Rashbam says, Shekulo Yafa, it's about 10 lines upper before the Rashbam gets wide. So Shekulo Yafa, Destam Yayin Yafa Ba'inon, V'lo Mekabel Alav Yud Kosesos. Shabbos says, so that Yayin Yafa means wine that will age. In other words, that's not going to go bad. That I'm capable of keeping for a while. However, if I say, Martef Zeh Shal Yayin Ani Mocher Lecha, if I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you this wine cellar, then what? No sin lo yayin hanimkar bechanos. Then I will say, I give him store wine. Then I will say, now what's store wine? So this is very interesting. So store wine means like this. Apparently, I will say, merchants would often sell wine that was on the verge of turning. So what's the chap? Now we'll define this later on. It's wine that tastes perfectly fine, but begins to smell like vinegar. The chap of store wine, I will say, is that people are buying it for what purpose? Immediate consumption. So for immediate consumption, and we can also understand they're buying wine for common everyday use. So for immediate consumption, even if the smell is a little bit off, if the taste is fine, I'm willing to buy it. So if I go ahead, listen to this interesting lashon. If I say Martev Shal Yayin, so a wine cellar indicates I'm buying this even for long-term use. Therefore, the wine has to be able to keep. If, however, again I say Martev Zeh, so Zeh apparently has a connotation of immediacy. If it's immediacy, then what? Then I'm buying, then even if it's wine that's like sold in the store, i.e. ready to turn, then Lamaisa, again, the sale is good. Martev Zani Mocha. So the Gemara says, Martev, fine. Martev Zani Mocha Lacha, Afilo Kulo Chometz, Higiu. So this is this. If I just say Martev, I'm selling you this cellar, but I never say what? I never say or, I never say wine. I never mentioned yayin. Then I both say it turns out that even if I sold them a cellar filled with vinegar, ultimately the sale is good. So both say the shaila is which is our Mishnah, because none of these cases seem to conform to our Mishnah. And our Mishnah discussed this idea that whenever I buy a wine cellar, I'm accepting a spoilage rate of 10 barrels per 100. To which the Gemara said, "Olam da'amrei martev shal yayin stam." Both say the case of our Mishnah is where I sold Ruvain and I told Ruvain, I'm selling you a wine cellar. Now, here's the problem. We just said before that if I said wine cellar, then Lamaisik, I have to sell him wine that's capable of aging, and there seems to be no spoilage provision. To which the Gemara says, "Tani bereisha de braysa u'mekabel alav eser kosesos lamea," and you have to add into the braysa that the purchaser has to accept a spoilage rate of 10 per 100. Ubistami mekabel. We'll say, is that true? When someone goes in and purchases a wine cellar, that they accept upon themselves a 1/10 spoilage rate? Is that really true? The Gemara says, "V'hat ta'ani," but we learn, "Hamocher chaves yayin lechavero, no sin lo yayin shekulu yafeh." But we'll say we learned that if I sell my friend a barrel of wine, now granted this is a barrel, not a cellar, not a cellar with a C, right? If I go ahead and I sell my friend a barrel of wine, then what's the halacha? We'll say that barrel has to be perfectly good. To which the Gemara says, you see, there's no provision for spoilage. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Shiny chavis, tekula chad chamim. Both say there could be no provision of spoilage in a barrel. Why? Because it's one entity. Therefore, what? Once part of it begins to spoil, then what? Both say, then the entire thing is affected. I v'hatani b'zvid b'debei Reb Oshia martif shayayin ani mocher lecha no sin lo yayin shekulu yafe. We both say we learned in the Yeshiva of Oshia that if I sell Ruvain, a wine seller, no sin lo yayin shekulu yafe. I just tell him martev shal yayin, I have to give him all good wine. Martev zeh shal yayin ani mocher lecha no sin lo yayin shekulu yafe. If I say to him, I'm selling you this martev, then I will say, what's talacha? I have to give him perfectly good wine, but there's a spoilage provision of 10 per 100. I will say, Amud Beis, Tzadik Amud Beis, V'zehu, and it says the Gemara, V'zehu, Outzer Sheshanu Chachamim Mishnasenu. And I will say, this is the case of the wine seller that we learned in our Mishnah. Ella Masnisin Nami de Amar Lezeh. Here I will say, here's the problem. Our Mishnah is where ultimately again the seller said zeh martev zeh. If that's the case, kasha zeh azeh. Both say we seem to have a contradiction between the two cases of zeh. Both say take a look at the Rashbam on the top of Tzaddik Hamad Beis. Brayse de la'el b'Rav Zevid kashin adoni. Both say we seem to have a stira. We seem to have a contradiction ultimately again between the two cases of zeh. How so? So look at the Rashbam. Dila'el katani b'martev zeh shayayin dinosin lo yayin animkar b'chanos v'hach b'Rav Zevid katani shekulu yafa v'kibul kosel. So both say we now have two alternate versions of zeh. If I say, here's what we know. Let's go with what we know. If I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you martev shal yayin. I'm selling you a wine. So what's the halacha? What's the halacha? All good wine. All good wine. If I say martev zeh shal yayin ani mocher lecha, I'm selling you ultimately again a wine seller. So we'll say now we have a machlokes. Wine seller could either mean what? Wine seller could either mean this wine seller, I'm selling you store wine, which I will say is wine that is on the verge of turning, or I'm selling you good wine, but you accept upon yourself a spoilage rate of 10 barrels per 100. So the point I will say is that we have a machlokes now, a stira, contradiction I should say, between the two cases of zeh. So which one is it? Lo kasha, we'll say, Tzadik Hamad Beis, 95b, third line down. It's not a contradiction. Oh, we'll say this is very interesting. Had amar le mikvah, had lo amar le mikvah. So we'll say everything depends. So one case is talking about a situation where I told, I'm the purchaser now. I told Ruvain, I'm purchasing it for cooking purposes. And one case where I didn't tell him purchase it for cooking purposes. We'll say, when you purchase wine for cooking purposes, the assumption is what? That you're going to use it over a much longer period of time. As such, what? The wine cannot be wine that is turning. So the Gemara suggests the following, Rabbi say, if I tell Ruvain that I am purchasing wine for the purposes of cooking, and he says what? And he says, I'll sell you martev zeh, then Rabbi say, what does that mean? That means that ultimately, again, I perhaps accept upon myself a spoilage rate of 10 per 100, but lamaisa, again, it can't be wine that is fit to be sold in a store. If on the other hand, I did not tell him that I'm purchasing it for cooking purposes, then what Rabbi say, it could even be wine that's sold in the store, because the assumption is I'm using it for immediate consumption. So which the Gemara says, Rav Zevid lemikfa. So in Rav Zevid's case, it's where the purchaser told the seller that he's purchasing it for cooking purposes. But the Raisa will say is talking about a case where he did not tell him that he's purchasing it for cooking purposes. Hilchach. So we'll say, so now the Gemara is going to give us halacha l'maisa. At least it's going to stand for the next 2 minutes. Hilchach. Therefore the Gemara says the following. We'll say, pay close attention to this. 95b, 6 lines down. Hilchach. Therefore we'll say the halacha is the following. Martev shal yayin. So both says, what happens if I sell Ruvain, a wine seller, and Ruvain tells me that he's using it for cooking purposes? He explicitly articulates the purpose ultimately again of his purchase. He tells me he's using it for cooking. No sin lo yain shekulu yafa. I have to give him wine. Both say that's what? That is totally good. Wine that is totally good. Meaning yain shekulu yafa means wine that will last. Because we'll say there he explicitly articulated his purposes for the purchase. Martev zeh shal yain. If I say to Reuben, I'm selling you this martev, And Reuven says, that's fine, but no, that I'm purchasing it for cooking purposes. Then no sin lo yayin shekulu yafa. Then Rabbi say, I have to give Reuven wine that will last. However, umekabel alav eser kosesos lemeya. But Reuven has to accept upon himself a spoilage rate of 10 barrels per 100. Martev zeh shal yayin v'lo amar li mikva. But if I said to Reuven, I'm selling you this seller of wine, this wine seller, and Reuven did not articulate that he's purchasing it for the purposes of cooking, no sin lo yayin hanim karbachanos. Then ultimately, again, I could sell Reuven even store wine. And Rabbi say, even though the Gemara is going to challenge this in just a moment, they'll know that this is in fact halacha lamaisa. This is if I saw again, we'll review it in just a moment. Ibailu, so then ask the kasha. What happens if martev shal yayin v'lo amar leit lemikva mai? We'll say, so what happens if I sell Reuven? I say, Reuven, I'm selling you a wine seller, and Reuven did not tell me, however, that he's purchasing it for the purposes of cooking. What's the status? So pligi bar of achav ravina. So we'll say this is machlokes in Rav Ravina. Chad amar mekabel. So one says that the purchaser is mekabel 10 barrels of spoilage per 100. The chad amar lo mekabel, and the other opinion said no, the purchaser is not mekabel. We'll say first wide line tzadikei amad beis. Says the Gemara, man amar mekabel daik midrav zvid. So we'll say the one who says that the purchaser is mekabel spoilage in this case is medayik based on Rav Zvid. Because what did Rav Zvid say? Diktani marteif shal yain ani mochelecha. Because Rav Zvid said that if I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a wine seller, no sin lo yain shekulu yafe. The halacha bosai is that I have to go ahead and give Reuven wine that is all good. All good meaning I will say what? No issue of spoilage. V'ukimno, and we've established that case, the Amar Leila Mikvah, where Reuven explicitly articulated is purchasing it for cooking purposes. Time of the Amar Leila Mikvah. The reason ultimately, again, I will say that, again, there's no spoilage provision here, is because Reuven explicitly said that he's purchasing it for cooking. Halo Amar Leila Mikvah, but had Reuven not said that he's purchasing it for cooking, then Mekabel. Then ultimately he accepts some level of spoilage. Uman to Amar Lo Mekabel. But I will say the opinion who says that in this case, there is no provision for spoilage. Daik mibraisa. He's been daik from the Braisa. What did the Braisa say? Diktani martev shayani mochelecha. Where again the seller said to the purchaser, I'm selling you a wine cellar. No sin lo yayin shekulo yafe. Ultimately, again, the seller is obligated to provide the purchaser with wine that is good, fully good, meaning no spoilage. Vukimna telo amrle lemikva. And again, we've established that case even where the purchaser did not articulate that he was purchasing it for the purposes of cooking. Ulaman the daik mi Rav Zvid kashya braisa. But according to the one who makes the daik from Rav Zvid, the braisa poses a kasha, to which the Gemara says, you're right, here's how you have to read it. When is this so? The Amar Leila Mikvah. When ultimately, again, the purchaser articulated that he's purchasing it for the purpose of cooking. Halo Amar Leila Mikvah. But were it to not say that I purchased it for the purposes of cooking, Mikabel. Ultimately, again, he accepts upon himself some level of spoilage. Umartef zeh shal yayin, right? Velo amar leila mikvah, no sin lo yayin karbachanos. But I will say, and if the seller says, I'm selling you this wine cellar, and the purchaser never made any mention that he's purchasing it for the purposes of cooking, then ultimately, again, I will say, you give him yayin hanim karbachanos. You ultimately can give him store wine. Ulaman de daik mibraisa kasha de Rav Zvid. But according to the one who made the dig from the Braisa, Rav Zvid's position is a kasha. Do kimna da amalei lemikva, because also we've established it as a case of where he said that the purchaser said to the seller, I'm purchasing it for the purpose of cooking. Halo amalei lemikva mekabel. But yet if he did not say that he was purchasing it for the purpose of cooking, he would be mekabel some spoilage. To which the Gemara says, Hu adin da'afa gavtalo amalei lemikva lo mekabel. In reality, even if the purchaser did not say that he was accepting it, that he was purchasing it for the purposes of cooking, lo makabel, he would not accept any level of spoilage. V'haidu kimla darmele mikvah mishum dekasha ze'azeh. And the only reason he went ahead and we established it as a case of where he was saying it, that he was purchasing it for the purposes of cooking, was in order to avoid the stira between the two cases of zeh. Fine, so we'll say, pause here for just a moment. So what is the halacha? These are important halachas to know. So we'll say essentially we have the following distinctions. If a seller says to a purchaser, I'm selling you marteif shal yayin, Martev shal yayin. I'm selling you a wine cellar. Then Rabbi say the halacha is that ultimately, again, he has to sell him wine that will last. Wine that will last. And apparently, again, there is no provision for spoilage under those circumstances. Therefore, he has to sell him ultimately, again, completely good wine and wine that will last. How long lasting? His lasting seems to be governed by the marketplace. If he says, Martev ze shal yayin, if he says, I'm selling you this, so both say, what the Gemara is driving at over here is the word ze, this, seems to have, it's not just a way of identifying product, but it also apparently identifies a time frame of usage. So zeh ultimately connotes immediacy. So if I say to Reuven, I'm selling you Martev zeh, this wine cellar, which has a connotation of immediacy, then what Rabbi say? Then I'm selling him Yayin Hanimkar Bechanos. Then I'm selling him ultimately again what? I'm selling him store wine. Rabbi say, what's store wine? It's not the wine that comes in a box, right? But again, store wine, I'm selling you again wine that is on the verge of turning. Totally consumable, totally good. The smell is a bit off, but the taste is fine because the assumption is you are purchasing it. Oh, I know. I don't mean to offend anyone with these conversations. I'm saying for the common man, right? For the proletariat, So ultimately, again, it's fine. Again, I will say, understand. This is also, again, I can't say it. This is not a society where wine is not simply, like a recreational drink. Wine is a staple. I know. Maybe I'm talking to people anyway if wine is a staple, but again, but again, meaning it was a daily drink. So as such, again, it was common in the marketplace that you would buy wine as long as its taste was fine, even if the smell was a bit off. So that will say that's the case of Martev zeh. When does everything change? And this is really very fascinating because we see this theme over and over again. Things change when what? When a purchaser, Rabosai, goes ahead and indicates the purpose of his purchase. So when the purchaser says, understand, I'm buying it for X, then Rabosai, then everything changes. So once the purchaser goes ahead and says, I'm purchasing it for what? I'm purchasing it for mikveh, for cooking, then Rabosai says, let's go back for just a second. So if I say, now what we have is an interesting interplay, very quickly, an interesting interplay between what the seller am saying and what the purchaser is saying. So if the purchaser says, I'm buying it for cooking, then Rabbi say, if I say Martev shal yayin, then all the wine has to be good. That's the same case. If I say Martev zeh, but the purchaser said that what? That he's going ahead and purchasing it for cooking, then Rabbi say, what's the halacha in that case? Then spoilage. Then what the purchaser is accepting is 10 barrels of spoilage per 100. Because Rabbi say, remember again, once the purchaser is saying that he's purchasing it for cooking, I can't sell him yain hanimkar bechanos. I can't sell him store wine. Why? Because we'll say that's on the verge of turning, and whenever somebody's purchasing wine for the purposes of cooking, it has to last. Okay, so those are all of our cases. Now we'll say now we're about to start something riveting, which is going to take us into tomorrow. So now that we began this discussion ultimately about wine that's about to turn, so watch this. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda, we'll say 5 lines up from the bottom side, they came in days. Amar Rav Yehuda, Yain hanimkar bechanos. So we'll say store wine, which is this wine that is about to turn. Mevarchen alav brei pri hagafen. Oh, we'll say now we're going to get into some interesting halachas. Right? What bracha do you make? So wine that is about to turn, you make the bracha of borei pri hagafen. This is Rav Yehuda's position. Brei pri hagafen. Rav Chisda Amar, Kabe chamra da'akrin lamali. Rav Chisda said, what are you talking about? By this wine, chamra da'akrin. We'll say if you take a look. Look at Rashbam. So Rashbam says, "Da'akrim igra balaz hainu yaim koses." Right, wine that is about to spoil. It was like koses actually means bubbles. What it sounds like is again, like when wine turns, it gets that I don't know what the technical term is, but almost like. Like that more acidic feel. So the Gemara says the following. So we'll say, Rav Yehuda says that even when wine is about to turn, what we call yain and nimkar b'chana, store wine, you make a brei pri hagafen. Rav Chisda says, no, you don't make a brei pri hagafen. Lamali, why would you make a brei pri hagafen? And then Rabbi say, now again, interestingly enough, so according to Rav Chisda, so what bracha are you making on that wine? So we'll say, Rav Chisda is going to say, you're going to make a shahakal. So we'll say, let's be clear on one thing. Even wine that is about to turn is still drinkable. It's still drinkable. As such, again, lemaisa, even if you're not going to make a brei pri hagafen, you're still going to make a shehakol. So the Gemara asks the kasha on Rav Yehuda. So says the Gemara, actually, take a look. Yeah, just look at the Rashbam Lamali for just a moment. Lamali, levarich alav ela shakol miyeh bidvaro. So we'll say, if Chista says, no, you're not going to make a brei pri hagafen on this store wine, rather you will make a shehakol. The high yain nimkar b'chanos. So we'll say here, interesting, we're speaking about this the whole daf. This is the first time the Rashbam gives the definition. The high yain nimkar b'chanos. By the way, what is store wine? Hu yayin ra, shericho chometz, v'tamo yayin. V'tamo yayin adas. Well, so this is it. Here's the definition. It smells like vinegar, but tastes like wine. So Rav Yehuda says you make a hagafen. Rav Chista says you make a shehakol. So I'll say, so watch this. Meisvei ala pas she'ifsha. This will say it takes us back to our brachas days. Good memories of brachas, right? They're coming up. It's 5 years ago this summer. So ala pas she'ifsha va'ala yayin shehikrim. So I'll say, if you have bread that has turned moldy, I will say, when we say moldy, it's still edible, but moldy. In other words, that you would cut it. I will say, you have to understand, we live in such different times, right? I remember when I was a child in the shtetl, right? You know, we live in such different times. We live in a very disposable society. So lemaisa, again, if bread gets a little whatever, you throw it out. Times if you give our bread gets a little bit mold, what do? You're right, you pick it off, and you go on with your business. So I'll say, so the bread begins to turn, or yain shehikrim, the wine begins to turn. Balat havshil sha'avra tsuraso. Or I will say, you have a tavshil, avra tsuraso means just doesn't look right. Just doesn't look right. So we'll say, all of these foods are in the initial stages of spoilage. That's the chapter. All in the initial stages of spoilage. Omer shahakol nihiyeh bidvaro. So we'll say in all of these cases, what's the halacha? You say shahakol. So we'll say this brisa supports Rav Chista and is a kasha on Rav Yehuda. Because Rav Yehuda said that on one, now we'll say we're not so concerned about bread right now, and we're not so concerned about the tavsh right now. What are we concerned about? Wine. Remember again, what do I do with store wine? Wine that smells like vinegar but tastes like wine. Rav Yehuda says you make a shahakol. You make a brei pri hagafen. Rav Chista says you make a shahakol. We have a brisa that seems now to contradict Rav Yehuda, support Rav Chista, because the brisa says that essentially when food begins to turn, among those foods, wine, the halacha is you recite a shahakol. Amar Rav Zvid, no, Rav Zvid said that price is a different case. What's that case? I will say Amar Rav Zvid, Mod Rav Yehuda, bepurtzima dimizdabin akarnosa. Even Rav Yehuda agrees with the purtzima wine. We will say, what's purtzima wine? Take a look at the Rashbam. Bepurtzima. First of all, just take a quick look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Omer shakol niya bidvaro, ulemiute asad lo yivarech ala pas berchas hamotzi. So we'll say, once the bread becomes moldy, so you don't go ahead and make hamotzi on it. The halav lechemhu. Because we'll say, once the bread begins to go moldy, it has lost its identity to a degree as bread. Fine. So again, the Gemara therefore suggests, this price of us I said about port sama wine. And even Rav Yehuda, who says that you say a hagafen on store wine, will agree that by purtzima wine, you only see a shakal. We'll say, what's purtzima wine? Look at the Rashbam. Purtzima, it's 7 lines up in the Rashbam from the bottom. Yayin ra yoser me'osar nimkar b'chanos. We'll say, this is even worse than store wine. Now, how do you know it's worse than store wine? Because it can't even be sold in the stores. We'll say it's interesting. Where is it sold? This is interesting. She'ino nimkar ela bekranos ha'ir beparshas durachim. We'll say it was only sold at intersections. So apparently they used to sell wine at intersections, right? Either Kronos, right? It's an interesting idea, right? Again, leaving aside the vehicular issues that causes, right? When you're drinking in your wagon or whatever it is, they're going ahead and they're selling it by literally Kronos are the corners. Prashas Drachim are the intersections. Sheyesh Sham Lokhin Harbi. Well, let's listen to this. There are a lot of purchasers there. Ve'im bedaktikin Mayiknu kefisha. They're both saying they're not as medaktik. The people purchasing wine at the intersections on the roads are not as medaktik on what they're purchasing. I'm sorry? Just the alcohol, right? Shenishtanam ar iso bertzuv mitoch shura harbe. So we'll say the Rashan then quotes Rabbeinu Chananel. Rabbeinu Chananel says Purtzuma means wine that ultimately again not only has its smell changed, but what? Its appearance has changed as well. So two different versions. I will say Purtzuma either means wine that's so turned that it's not sold in the stores, it's only sold on the street, sold on the intersections, or the possibility is that it's wine so bad that not only has the smell changed, but the appearance has changed as well. The Gemara suggests that even Rav Yehuda, who says that you say Bari Pri Hagafen on store wine, will agree that what? That when it comes to Purtzoma wine, this wine ultimately, again, that's either its appearance has changed or that is sold on the roads, even he will agree that Lamaisa, again, this wine only gets a shakol miyabidvaro and not a Bari Pri Hagafen. So we'll stop over here for today. We will, Emirat Hashem, continue with the brachos discussion, Emirat Hashem, into tomorrow. Tomorrow we resume a normal schedule. Kan HaEmuna at 5:45, Daf Yomi at 6. Shkoyach. A good chodesh. Shall we you? Thank you.
When it says Rabbi Yehuda, is that